On my 65th birthday, I stood at my son's door. He looked me in the eyes and said, "You're not welcome here." Behind him, my grandson laughed. A boy who didn't even know I existed. I didn't fight. I simply turned away, calm. Months later, when I held the lottery ticket worth $220 million, everything changed. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Helen Carter woke on her 65th birthday to the hollow silence that had haunted her mornings for the last 15 years. The small Portland apartment felt colder than usual, shadows stretching across the linoleum as she shuffled into the kitchen and brewed us her coffee. On the table, a lone birthday card from her church sat beside a framed photograph of her son, David, taken almost 2 decades ago. His smile was frozen in time, a reminder of the boy who once clung to her during thunderstorms, who couldn't fall asleep without her kiss goodnight. Her fingers brushed the glass, and a sharp ache pierced her chest. Somewhere between the endless night shifts at the hospital, the lectures about saving money, and the warnings she thought were guidance, she had become the mother her only child could not bear. When David's father walked out, survival meant sacrifice. Every extra hour Helen worked as a nurse was to secure her son's future. New books, soccer cleats, tuition that would one day carry him to college. But to David, those hours looked like absence, her cautious budgeting like control, her advice like chains. The final rupture had come down to $5,000. David, at 25, had stood before her with a fire in his eyes. He had called it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, an investment in medtech solutions that would change everything. Helen remembered the way his hands shook, the certainty in his voice, the desperation under his confidence. She had seen that same look with 3 other sure things that had already drained his savings. "I can't, David," she told him quietly. "That money is for emergencies." His face hardened into something she didn't recognize. "You've never trusted me. You only know how to control, how to withhold. If you really loved me, you'd believe in me." Her reply had come too fast, sharpened by exhaustion. "You don't want my trust. You want my money." She had regretted those words every single day since. Now, on the morning of her 65th birthday, the regret weighed heavier than the years themselves. She stared at the fading photograph and whispered to the empty room, "No more lonely anniversaries." By noon, she was on the highway, her old Honda humming beneath her as she drove north toward Seattle. The miles stretched endlessly, each one a mixture of dread and fragile hope. She had rehearsed her words countless times over the years. Apologies, explanations, pleas. But as the city skyline rose before her, her mind went blank. The neighborhood where David lived was nothing like the cramped apartment she called home. His house was 2 stories of polished stone and manicured hedges, the kind of home she could never have afforded even with a lifetime of double shifts. Balloons bobbed against the front porch rail, laughter spilling faintly through the windows. Of course, she and David shared a birthday. Today he turned 40. Her hands trembled as she pressed the doorbell. The laughter inside fell silent. Footsteps approached, steady, unhurried. Then the door opened, and there he was, her son, taller than she remembered. His sweater expensive, his hair cut with precision. For one suspended second, she saw the child he had been, but then his expression iced over. "What are you doing here?" His voice was cold, clipped, as if she were a stranger trespassing on his doorstep. Before she could answer, a woman appeared at his side, Laura, his wife. Her gaze swept over Helen with a chill assessment, the kind that dismissed without a word. "Today isn't a good time," David said, his hand already pushing the door closed. But not before Helen caught sight of a boy darting through the living room, a flash of dark hair, the curve of a smile that mirrored David's childhood face. Her grandson. "Please," she whispered, her throat burning. "I only wanted to wish you happy. You're not welcome here." The words fell like stone, final and merciless. The door clicked shut. Laughter resumed behind the walls as if she had never been there. Helen stood on the porch, the cool air biting at her skin, tears sliding hot down her cheeks. 15 years of silence, and her son could not spare 5 minutes on the day that tied them together by birth. The drive home blurred past in streaks of headlights and rain. She wasn't sure which wound cut deeper, that David had once again rejected her, or that the child she had glimpsed inside, her own grandson, didn't even know she existed. Back in her apartment, the balloon she had seen still haunted her vision. She set her untouched coffee aside and lowered herself into the worn armchair. The photo of David stared back at her, smiling from a world that no longer belonged to her. The ache in her chest deepened into something rawer, more desperate. That night, as the city outside hummed and her apartment settled into silence, Helen Carter finally admitted the truth she had resisted for 15 years. Her son had erased her from his life, and yet somewhere behind that closed door in Seattle, a boy was growing up without knowing his grandmother's love. For the first time in years, Helen no longer felt only sorrow. Beneath the grief was a spark, fragile but fierce, a quiet vow that this birthday would not end like the others. Something had to change. The library became Helen Carter's refuge. Its quiet aisles and endless shelves of books offered a kind of companionship that didn't judge or turn her away. She spent hours there, reshelving, sorting, breathing in the scent of paper and dust. It was easier to lose herself in the order of catalog numbers than to dwell on the chaos of her own life. One afternoon, while she was alphabetizing a stack of biographies, a voice broke through her solitude. "You're carrying something heavy," it said gently. Helen looked up to see a woman sliding into the chair across from her, Grace Mitchell. She was elegant even in her retirement, a former attorney with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Helen forced a smile. "I guess everyone carries something." "But not everyone wears it so clearly," Grace replied. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, and Helen felt the walls she'd built over the years falter under its weight. At first, she deflected with polite small talk, insisting she was fine. But Grace's calm persistence, her no-nonsense presence, chipped away at the armor Helen had worn for so long. Within days, Helen found herself telling this near stranger everything. The estrangement from David, the years of silence, the humiliating birthday at his doorstep. Grace listened without interruption, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When Helen finished, her throat raw from the words she'd never spoken aloud, Grace leaned forward. "Have you tried writing to him?" Helen gave a bitter laugh. "Letters, emails, cards, 15 years of them, all ignored or returned unopened." "Not the kind of letter I mean," Grace said. "I'm talking about the truth, not what you think he wants to hear. The raw truth." That night, Helen sat at her small kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. The pen hovered in her hand, trembling, until at last she pressed it down. Words poured out in an unstoppable tide. She wrote of the terror that had driven her to control, how every warning, every refusal had been born from the fear of losing David the way she'd lost his father. She confessed how she had followed his life from a distance, clinging to scraps of news from mutual acquaintance, desperate for any sign of him. She admitted her regret, her sorrow, her endless hope. And most of all, she begged to know her grandson, begged for one chance to make things right. The pages filled with ink and tears, her hand cramped, but she didn't stop until everything inside her was laid bare. When she finally sealed the envelope, her heart beat with something fragile but alive. Hope. For 3 weeks she waited. Every day she checked the mailbox with shaking hands, her stomach twisting with both dread and longing. Then at last, a manila envelope arrived. She carried it inside, her pulse hammering in her ears. Sitting at the table, she tore it open, searching for words, for the smallest sign of reconciliation. Instead, torn scraps of paper spilled across her lap. Her own letter, shredded into jagged confetti. On top lay a yellow sticky note, scrawled in David's handwriting. "Stop trying to enter our lives." The room tilted around her. She sat motionless, the fragments of her heart scattered across the floor. It felt like dying without the release of death. A wound reopened so deep she couldn't breathe. That night, she opened her bedroom closet and reached for the box she kept hidden at the back. Inside lay 15 years' worth of unsent birthday gifts. Small packages wrapped in cheerful paper. Cards with messages of love written in a grandmother's hand for a boy who didn't know she existed. With trembling fingers, she placed the torn letter among them, another relic of a relationship that never was. She closed the box carefully, almost tenderly, and pushed it back into the shadows. Not gone, not destroyed, just sealed away with the reality she could not change. The next morning at the library, she moved among the shelves in silence. A mutual acquaintance mentioned offhandedly that David had been promoted to vice president of marketing at Bright Path Industries. Not MedTech, the company he had once begged her to invest in. Curious, Helen later searched online and discovered that MedTech had collapsed only 2 years after their fight. The irony left her hollow, not vindicated. Scrolling through David's social media, she saw the curated life he had crafted. Exotic vacations, elegant family portraits, captions celebrating promotions. One photo, taken on a beach, carried a line that made her chest tighten. Who needs family when you have success? Helen closed the laptop slowly, the calm in her chest unfamiliar. 15 years of begging for crumbs of affection, of clawing at the closed door of his heart. It had to end. She could no longer fight for someone who had written her out of his story so completely. That evening, she gathered the old cards and gifts, all the pieces of love that had nowhere to go, and placed them carefully into a storage container. She did not throw them away. She wasn't ready for that. But as she sealed the lid, she whispered into the quiet room, "They belong to a reality that will never exist." Her voice did not break. For the first time in years, it sounded steady. "Time to start living for myself." The words lingered in the air, fragile but resolute, carrying with them the faintest spark of a future she had never dared to imagine. Fate can turn on the smallest choices, and for Helen Carter, it began with $2 at the grocery store checkout. "Anything else?" the cashier asked, gesturing toward the display of lottery tickets. The jackpot had climbed to 220 million, the bright numbers glowing on a sign above the register. Customers before her had snatched tickets eagerly, their laughter filling the air with dreams of impossible wealth. Helen almost shook her head. For years she had looked down on games of chance. Too many nights as a nurse watching patients gamble away rent money while chasing luck that never came. But something about the moment, about surviving a full year without reaching out to David, made her pause. "Why not?" she murmured, sliding $2 across the counter. The ticket disappeared into her purse and was quickly forgotten. Days passed in routine, until one quiet evening, the television in her apartment hummed with the local news. She had half a plate of leftovers before her when the announcer's voice cut sharply through her thoughts. "Tonight's Powerball numbers are..." Helen froze, fork in midair, as the numbers scrolled across the screen. Her heart began to pound. She reached for her purse with shaking hands, pulling out the crumpled ticket. She checked once, twice, 3 times. The numbers matched. All of them. The room seemed a blur. She sat unmoving, staring at the slip of paper as if it might combust in her hand. Midnight came and went, the city outside alive with noise, but she remained in her chair, whispering to herself in disbelief. $220 million. The next morning, she sat across from an attorney, numb, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Is this real?" He studied the ticket, then her, and nodded slowly. "Yes, Mrs. Carter. After taxes, you're looking at roughly 128 million as a lump sum." The number was incomprehensible. She had lived her entire life stretching paychecks, scrubbing coins from the bottom of her purse to cover bills. Now, more money than she could imagine sat in her hands. "Oregon allows winners to claim through trusts or LLCs," the attorney explained. "We can protect some of your privacy. The name will be public record, but we can create a generic trust. I strongly advise it." Helen's mind spun, but one memory cut through the haze. David's face that day, all those years ago, when she refused him $5,000. His bitterness, his accusation that she didn't trust him. And here she sat now, holding enough money to erase every debt, every obstacle, every excuse. The attorney leaned forward. "You have to understand, Mrs. Carter. Once this becomes public, people will come out of the woodwork. Long-lost relatives, old friends. Everyone will want something from you." The word family hung in the air like smoke. David's face rose in her mind, then the fleeting image of Ethan running through the living room, the grandson she had never held. A strange sensation filled her chest, something sharp, not joy but power. For 15 years she had been powerless, begging for scraps of affection, waiting at a door that never opened. Now, for the first time, she held the cards. "Set up the trust," Helen said quietly. "I want to keep this as private as possible." She stepped into the bright Portland sunlight afterward, clutching her purse, her heart racing with a force she hadn't felt in years. The air tasted different. Months slipped by as she followed her financial advisor's careful guidance. The Carter family trust was established, her winnings placed under watchful management. Outwardly, nothing changed. Helen still volunteered at the library, still drove her 10-year-old Honda, still lived modestly. "You're the most disciplined lottery winner I've ever seen," Grace Mitchell remarked over coffee one afternoon, watching her friends sip tea calmly. Helen smiled faintly. "Discipline kept me alive raising a child on a nurse's salary. Flashy spending just invites questions." Still, she allowed herself one indulgence, a modest but beautiful 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood. To anyone who asked, she explained it away with a story about selling family property in the Midwest that had been tied up in probate for years. It was believable enough. 6 months later, Helen was rearranging books at the library when her phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender's name made her breath catch. "David Carter. Mom, it's been a while. Heard from Sarah Miller you moved into a nicer place. Everything okay? Maybe we could talk sometime." Her knees weakened. 15 years of silence, and now this casual message, as if he had only missed a few weeks. She leaned against the bookshelf, the phone trembling in her hand. That night, she researched Bright Path Industries. Article after article revealed a company drowning in scandal, investigations swirling around unethical marketing practices. David's name appeared in several reports. His career was on the verge of collapse. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. He had learned she might have money, and suddenly, after all these years, he remembered she existed. Helen closed the laptop, calm settling over her like armor. The old her might have rushed to answer, desperate for reconciliation. But this Helen was different. For the first time in her life, she wasn't begging. She was waiting. She allowed herself a slow smile, not of joy, but of resolve. The game had changed, and this time she would not play it the way he expected. Helen stared at David's email for hours before composing a response. She chose her words carefully, keeping them warm but distant, as if nothing more than casual politeness lingered between them. "Yes, I sold some family property. I moved into a safer neighborhood. How are you and the family?" The reply came within minutes. His tone was suddenly familiar, disarmingly friendly. He mentioned challenges at work, hinted at transitions, and then dropped the sentence that made Helen's breath catch. "Ethan is 12 now. He's always wanted to meet his grandmother. Perhaps we could have lunch sometime." For 15 years, she had longed for those words. Now they felt hollow, transparent, their weight measured not in affection, but in strategy. Still, her heart ached when she thought of Ethan, the boy she had seen only once through the narrow crack of a closing door. Whatever motives David carried, Ethan was innocent. He deserved the truth, or at least the chance to know his grandmother. "I'd love that," Helen wrote back, her fingers trembling slightly as she hit send. Seattle's Harbor View restaurant was David's choice, upscale with soaring glass walls that framed Elliott Bay in glittering blue. Helen arrived early, dressed with deliberate simplicity, a blue dress that suited her age and figure, a modest necklace, her new Volvo parked outside. Nothing extravagant, but enough to show she wasn't struggling. David and his family arrived precisely on time. He looked thinner than she remembered. Tension etched around his mouth despite the tailored clothes. Laura radiated polish, her designer outfit immaculate, her smile cool and appraising. But it was Ethan who stole Helen's breath. Tall for 12, with David's dark eyes and an uncertain expression, he extended his hand stiffly. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Carter." Her throat tightened. "You can call me Grandma," she said softly, offering him a smile. "Or Helen, if that feels easier." They sat together and David immediately seized control of the conversation, reciting Ethan's academic achievements as though he were delivering a resume. "Top of his class, excelling in sports," David declared proudly, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of a man used to selling success. Helen turned to Ethan. "What do you enjoy most in school?" His face lit with sudden animation. "Science and history. Right now, I'm working on a project about immigration patterns." But before he could continue, David cut in smoothly. "He excels in everything, just like I did." Helen noticed the way Ethan's shoulders dropped, the spark in his eyes dimming. The scene reminded her with painful clarity of David as a boy, silenced and overshadowed by a father who never recognized his voice. Laura leaned forward, her gaze sharp. It must have taken quite a bit from that property sale to afford your new neighborhood. Her eyes flicked toward Helen's necklace, her hands, her clothes, assessing, calculating. Helen smiled politely, choosing silence, and redirected her attention back to Ethan. He spoke shyly about his project until the check arrived. David patted his pockets with theatrical dismay. Seems I left my wallet in my other jacket. The gesture was almost insulting in its transparency. Helen glanced at the gleaming watch on his wrist, said nothing, and covered the bill without hesitation. In the parking lot afterward, David lowered his voice as Laura fussed with her phone. We're going through a rough patch. The company is reorganizing and Ethan's private school tuition is due soon. Things are difficult. Helen nodded, her expression serene. I'm just glad we're reconnecting. As the couple turned to their car, their voices rising in quiet argument, Ethan lingered near her. He looked up, hesitated, then spoke in a hush rush. You don't seem sick. Helen blinked. Sick? He darted a glance toward his parents. Dad said you had a brain disease, that you were confused, weak. That's why you never visited or called. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Before she could answer, David's sharp voice cut across the lot. Ethan, let's go. The boy startled, then quickly reached for Helen's phone. His small fingers typed swiftly before he darted back to his parents. When Helen slid into her car, her hands still trembling, she checked her phone. A new contact had been added. Ethan Carter. A single message followed. Can we talk sometimes? Tears blurred her vision, but they were not born of sorrow this time. They burned with something far more dangerous. Rage. Some lies cut deeper than absence. Discovering them feels like being buried alive, forced to claw through layers of betrayal just to breathe. Helen Carter realized this on the day she stepped into Ethan's middle school. He had invited her quietly over text, excited for his history presentation. She had driven to Seattle early, nerves rattling through her hands as she signed in at the office. The receptionist smiled warmly. You must be Ethan's grandmother. He's been talking about this all week. Her chest swelled. She followed the buzz of children's voices down the hall until she met Ethan's teacher, Mr. Anderson. He greeted her with open enthusiasm. Mrs. Carter, wonderful to finally meet you. Ethan told us you might come. Finally? She repeated softly. Mr. Anderson nodded. Yes. After hearing about your condition all these years, it's remarkable to see you doing so well. The floor tilted beneath her feet. Condition? She asked, her throat tightening. The teacher's expression faltered. The early onset dementia. Ethan even did a whole project last year on neurodegenerative diseases based on your experience. David explained it during every parent-teacher conference. Helen steadied herself against the wall, the blood rushing in her ears. Dementia. For 15 years, while she wrote letters and sent gifts, her son had told the world she was losing her mind. He had built a fiction so elaborate that even her grandson believed it. Her voice shook, but she forced composure. I see. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. The presentations began before she could gather her thoughts. She sat in the back row, rigid, as Ethan spoke with confidence about his family's immigration story, weaving in details she had shared over text. When his eyes found hers, his face lit up briefly before returning to his careful rhythm. Afterward, families mingled in the hallway. Laughter echoed, coats rustled, paper shuffled. Then Helen saw them, David and Laura, slipping in late, scanning the room. David's gaze landed on her and color drained from his face. He pulled her aside, his voice low and venomous. What are you doing here? Ethan invited me, Helen replied, her tone steady though her heart pounded. Interesting thing, Mr. Anderson mentioned my condition, the dementia you've been describing to everyone for years. David's eyes darted nervously. This isn't the place. No, Helen agreed. Her voice was calm, dangerously calm. But we will discuss it, soon. She walked away before he could answer, her hands trembling as Ethan hurried after her. His arms wrapped around her waist, his voice muffled against her shoulder. You came. Helen held him close, her first embrace with her grandson, while over his shoulder David's eyes burned cold and calculating. That night, she poured the story into Grace Mitchell's living room over tea. Her friend nearly dropped her cup. That's monstrous. To erase you with lies like that. Helen's voice was raw but firm. While I was sending cards and gifts, he was telling Ethan I was too sick to remember him. Grace set her cup down with deliberate precision, anger flashing in her eyes. What will you do? I don't know, Helen admitted. Part of me wants to tell Ethan everything, but it would only hurt him. The other part, she lifted her chin, meeting Grace's gaze, wants to understand how far this goes. The next morning, Grace introduced her to Robert Hayes, a discreet private investigator she trusted from her legal career. Just information gathering, she assured, nothing illegal. Or Robert was efficient. Within weeks, he returned with findings that surpassed Helen's darkest suspicions. David was drowning, his mortgage underwater, credit cards maxed out, loans at ruinous interest. Worse, his signature appeared on documents tied to Bright Path's scandal, marketing campaigns that exaggerated drug benefits while hiding side effects. Termination was looming, maybe even legal trouble. But what chilled Helen most were the papers Robert slid across her table. Applications for Ethan's transfer to an international school in Vancouver. A deposit already paid, residence documents in motion. They're planning to run, Robert explained, and they're counting on your money to fund it. Helen stared at the neat lines of text until the words blurred. Her son had not only cut her from his life, now he intended to uproot her grandson, to vanish across a border with her fortune as fuel. Over the next weeks, David's messages multiplied, each one thinly veiled, each one dripping with financial need. Tuition deadlines, housing issues, restructuring at work. Every line reeked of desperation. Meanwhile, Ethan's text painted another picture. Dad says you're the solution to everything if he can just close the deal soon. What does that mean? Helen stared at the screen, her chest aching for the fight caught between schemes he couldn't understand. She typed slowly, carefully. I'm not sure, sweetheart, but don't worry, I'll always be here for you. No matter what, this time, she would not break her promise. Her heart no longer ached with sorrow. It burned with fury and with resolve. The time for silence was over. Robert Hayes's report remained on Helen's kitchen table long after he had left. Pages filled with numbers, signatures, and dates blurred together. But the truth was undeniable. David was collapsing. His mortgage was bleeding him dry, his credit card strained beyond rescue, his name entangled in Bright Path's scandal. He wasn't simply struggling, he was cornered, clawing at any way out. The application to the Vancouver school for Ethan sat on top, crisp and damning. The deposit had been made. The residence paperwork was in process. David and Laura weren't just thinking of leaving. They were preparing to disappear. Helen ran her fingers over the page, her jaw tightening. For years, she had begged for crumbs of affection. Now her son was planning to use her, drain her, and vanish with the only person who mattered, her grandson. But this time, she wasn't powerless. She began to play her role with deliberate care. In conversations with David and Laura, she remained sympathetic, warm, even a little naive. When Laura met her for coffee, Helen let her catch sight of carefully placed bank statements poking from her purse. Documents showing only a fraction of her wealth, but enough to whet curiosity. She mentioned almost casually that she was meeting with a financial advisor to adjust her will, making sure Ethan would be secure for the future. The reaction was immediate. Laura's eyes sharpened, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. That's very thoughtful, she said smoothly, but her calculating gaze betrayed her excitement. At home that evening, Helen's phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. Dad and Mom are fighting a lot. I heard them talking about Vancouver again. Dad said you're the solution to everything if he can just close the deal soon. What does that mean? Helen sat in silence, her hand trembling over the keys. The image of Ethan, wide-eyed and trusting, cut her deeper than David's betrayal ever had. She typed slowly, choosing each word with care. I'm not sure, sweetheart, but don't worry. I promise I'll always be here for you no matter what. She set the phone down and pressed her palms against the table, her breath unsteady. It wasn't grief she felt anymore. It wasn't helplessness. It was rage sharpened into clarity. Days later, David invited her to dinner. "Just the two of us," he said, his tone rehearsed, his smile strained. He chose another expensive Seattle restaurant, a place far beyond what his financial wreckage should have allowed. Helen arrived on time, dressed with quiet elegance. As she sat across from her son, she studied him in the low light. For a fleeting moment, she glimpsed the boy he once had been, before the bitterness, before the lies. But the man before her was cloaked in desperation, his charm stretched thin over fractures he couldn't hide. David launched into a speech that sounded practiced, every line polished to pull at her heart. "I've been too proud, Mom, holding on to old grievances when we should have been coming together as a family." Helen nodded gently, offering nothing more than encouragement, while noting how his ways flicked again and again to her purse beside the table. "Nathan adores you," David continued, lowering his voice. "He talks about you all the time. Having his grandmother in his life has been so meaningful." Helen smiled faintly. "I treasure our relationship. He's a remarkable boy." David leaned forward. "Mom, I've been meaning to discuss something important, an opportunity that could solve everything." "Here it comes," she thought. "I'm starting a consulting firm," he said quickly, "pharmaceutical marketing compliance. With my experience at BrightPath, I know exactly what not to do. I could help companies navigate ethically. It's the perfect time, the perfect venture." Helen listened in silence, her expression thoughtful as he spoke. He painted the picture of a bright future, of success within reach, if only she would help. The startup costs he listed matched almost exactly the debt Robert had uncovered. "I'm offering you a chance to invest in more than a business," David concluded, his eyes fixed on hers. "It's a chance to invest in our family's future. If you help with this and assist with our current house challenges, I promise you'll be a permanent part of Nathan's life." The words struck her like ice. Her son was selling her access to her grandson. "You're not asking for charity?" Helen repeated softly, her tone neutral. "You're offering a partnership. In business? In family?" His face brightened, eager. "Exactly." He hesitated, then added, "We'd be nearby. Well, relatively nearby. Vancouver has an emerging biotech sector. Nathan's already on the wait list for Cambridge International Academy. It's very exclusive. We need to secure his spot by next week." Helen sipped her water, her hands steady though her pulse thundered. Vancouver, just as Robert had uncovered. "I'll need to think about it," she said calmly. David's smile tightened. "Don't take too long. Opportunities like this move quickly." That night, long after she returned home, a text from Ethan lit her phone. "Grandma, I overheard Mom and Dad fighting after dinner. Dad said they need to close the deal with the old lady before she changes her mind. I think they meant you. They're talking about moving to Canada, but they haven't told me. Please don't say I said this." Helen sat in the dark, her phone clutched in her hand, her heart aching for the child caught in the crossfire. For years she had mourned the loss of her son, but now she mourned something else. The man she had thought he was. Her sorrow hardened into resolve. The time for games was almost over. Revenge sometimes arrives dressed as justice, and for Helen Carter, the line between them blurred the moment she invited her son back into her home. She staged it carefully. Her new house in Portland was modest but comfortable, filled with warmth rather than opulence. Nothing in it screamed wealth, though every detail had been chosen with intention. The guest room preparing for Ethan had a telescope on the balcony, positioned toward Mount Hood. It was bait, but also truth. She wanted him to feel he belonged there. When David, Laura, and Ethan arrived for the weekend, their eyes swept the house in different ways. David lingered on the artwork in the entryway. Laura cataloged every item with quick, calculating glances, and Ethan's gaze went straight to the telescope, his excitement unfiltered. "Beautiful place, Mom," David said, his voice threaded with something between admiration and suspicion. "The family property sale helped," Helen replied vaguely, ushering them inside. Throughout the weekend, Helen observed, David and Laura performed the roles of devoted parents when they believed she was watching, but their masks slipped in private moments. They dismissed Ethan's stories, silenced his questions, and exchanged impatient glances when his enthusiasm ran too long. When Ethan was with her, however, his shoulders straightened, his laughter flowed freely, his stutter disappeared. He reminded her achingly of David at that age, before resentment had poisoned everything. On Saturday afternoon, while David and Laura took a walk that Helen suspected was really a strategy session, Ethan slipped into her room holding a brochure. "I found this in Dad's briefcase," he whispered. Helen unfolded the glossy paper. Cambridge International Academy. Photographs of an imposing campus in Vancouver filled the pages. "I don't want to go there, Grandma," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "All my friends are in Seattle, and I just found you." Helen gathered him into her arms, pressing her cheek against his hair. "Whatever happens, we won't lose each other again. I promise." That night, she cooked David's childhood favorites: pot roast with carrots, warm rolls, and apple pie. The familiar scents filled the air, softening the edges of the evening. David and Laura exchanged small, satisfied glances, convinced this was the sign of her surrender. When dinner ended, Helen invited them into the living room. The air shifted as she placed a thick folder on the coffee table. "I have something important to share," she began. Her voice was calm but steel-threaded every word. "15 years ago, David, you walked out of my life over $5,000. Today, it seems money is the only thing that brought you back." David's smile faltered. "Mom, that's not fair." Helen raised a hand, silencing him. "I hired a private investigator." Color drained from David's face. Laura stiffened, her hand frozen around her glass. Helen opened the folder, sliding photographs and documents across the table. "He found everything. The lies about my supposed dementia, your mounting debts, the Vancouver plans you've kept from Ethan, the Bright Path investigation. I know exactly why you remembered you had a mother after 15 years. Laura shot to her feet. "This is outrageous. You spied on us." "I protected myself," Helen corrected, her tone still quiet, almost gentle. "And I protected Ethan." David's mask cracked, anger flaring. "So this whole reunion was just a setup? You're no better than what you claim we are." "The difference," Helen said evenly, "is that I wanted to know my grandson. You just wanted my money." The silence was pierced by Ethan's trembling voice. "Is it true, Dad? About Grandma's disease? About moving to Vancouver?" David's mouth opened, then closed. His silence was all the confirmation Ethan needed. The boy's eyes filled, his voice breaking. "You lied. All these years, you lied." The air in the room grew heavy, thick with everything unsaid. Laura pressed her lips together, her calculating gaze flicking between her husband and the evidence on the table. Helen rose slowly, laying a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You deserved the truth a long time ago," she whispered. David's fury burned across the room, but Helen no longer felt powerless under it. She had spent 15 years begging for a place in his life. Tonight, the balance had shifted. For the first time, she held the ground. The battle lines had been drawn, not in whispers or desperation, but in truth laid bare. This was no longer about reconciliation. It was about what came next. And Helen was ready. Morning light filled Helen Carter's living room, casting long streaks across the hardwood floor, where the folder still lay from the night before. The atmosphere was thick with silence, heavy with the weight of what had been exposed. David sat slouched, his face gray with exhaustion, while Laura perched tensely on the edge of her chair, lips pressed thin. Ethan stood by the window, shoulders drawn tight, eyes hollow with the shock of betrayal. Helen placed a manila envelope on the coffee table. Her voice, calm but unwavering, cut through the stillness. "I have a proposal." David's eyes narrowed. "More investigator reports?" "No," she slid the envelope closer. "A potential solution." Inside were documents she had spent weeks preparing. She explained each point with deliberate clarity. She would pay off their mortgage, eliminating the crushing debt strangling their household. She would also establish a trust dedicated solely to Ethan's education, ensuring his future could not be touched by their financial recklessness. But there were conditions. They would remain in Seattle, not flee to Canada. Ethan would spend one weekend each month with her, no exceptions. And they would attend family therapy together, every one of them. Laura's sharp laugh rang out, brittle as glass. "You're bribing us." "I'm offering a path forward," Helen replied. "Not running from problems, not hiding behind lies, not using Ethan as leverage." David's face flushed, his voice low and trembling. "You have no right to dictate our lives." No, Helen admitted, her gaze steady on him. I don't. You're free to refuse, but if you do, know this. Nathan will remain in my life either way. I'll petition for grandparent visitation rights, and I have more than enough documentation of your deceptions to make a strong case. It was a calculated risk. She knew the law did not always favor grandparents, but David didn't need to know that. You're blackmailing us, he spat. Helen's tone softened, though her eyes never wavered. I'm giving us a chance to rebuild. Not on money, not on manipulation, but on honesty. Nathan deserves better than what we've given him so far. Laura opened the envelope, her practical nature overtaking her indignation. She leafed through the financial outlines, her brow furrowed in concentration. Numbers spoke to her more than emotion. David, however, stared at the floor, his jaw working furiously, shame and rage warring behind his eyes. For long moments, the only sound was the rustle of paper. Then Ethan's voice broke through, fragile but firm. Why, he asked, looking directly at his father. Why did you tell everyone Grandma was sick? Why did you lie to me? David flinched, his mouth opening, closing, but no words came. It wasn't complicated, Ethan pressed, his young voice hardening with resolve. You didn't want me to know her. You thought lying was easier. The room went still. Helen watched as something shifted in her grandson, innocence giving way to the sharp understanding of a child forced to grow up too quickly. He didn't glare with anger. He looked at his father with something far worse, disappointment. Ethan turned to Helen, his chin lifting with quiet strength. I think Grandma's idea is good. I want to try therapy. I want to stay in Seattle. And I want her in my life. For a moment, no one spoke. David stared at his son as though seeing him for the first time, not as an extension of himself, not as a pawn in his ambitions, but as a person standing his ground. His lips parted, but whatever words he tried to summon dissolved in the air. Laura, ever pragmatic, gathered the papers into a neat stack. We need time to discuss this, she said tightly, though her eyes betrayed the flicker of calculation already weighing their options. Helen nodded. Of course, but know this, Laura. Whatever you decide, Ethan and I will not be separated again. The tension lingered as they prepared to leave. David avoided Helen's gaze, his steps heavy, while Laura clutched the envelope to her chest. At the door, Ethan turned back suddenly and threw his arms around his grandmother. His hug was fierce, almost desperate. I'll see you in 2 weeks, he whispered into her ear, no matter what they decide. It was not a plea, it was a declaration, the first act of defiance from a boy claiming his own voice. Helen held him tightly, her eyes closing against the rush of emotion. In that embrace, she felt both the ache of all the years lost and the fragile hope of something new being born. When the door closed behind them, silence filled the house once more. Helen lowered herself into a chair, her body trembling, her heart raw. She had no illusions. This path would not be smooth. There would be resistance, anger, and setbacks. But the choice had been made. The power was no longer David's to grant or withhold. This time, it belonged to her. 18 months later, Helen Carter adjusted the birthday streamers strung across the backyard of David's Seattle home. The sun spilled across the lawn, catching the laughter of children and the hum of conversation. Today marked 3 milestones: her 67th birthday, David's 42nd, and Ethan's middle school graduation. The gathering was small but meaningful. Just family, a few of Ethan's friends, and Grace Mitchell, who had driven up from Portland. Helen paused for a moment, letting the scene settle inside her. A year and a half ago, the idea of celebrating together had felt impossible. Yet here she was, setting out plates beside her son's grill, listening to the one who had once been kept from her, now teasing her about overcooking the corn. The journey to this day had been anything but simple. David had agreed to her terms not out of desire, but necessity. The Bright Path scandal had threatened to consume him, and only by cooperating fully, admitting fault, and accepting a demotion had he managed to hold on to his career at all. The shame of it lingered, visible in the way he sometimes avoided her gaze, but he was still standing. Laura, too, had wrestled with her own demons: resentment, materialism, her hunger for status. For a time, Helen thought the marriage would collapse under the strain, but therapy peeled back layers neither of them had dared face before. In those sessions, Helen confronted her own part in the family's fracture. The control born of fear, the demands born of exhaustion, the love that often arrived wrapped in warnings rather than comfort. Grace had told her once that honesty is the cruelest gift and the most necessary. It proved true. The first months were brutal. David withdrew, shutting down during sessions, while Laura alternated between bitterness and fragile cooperation. Helen carried her own guilt like a stone, learning to speak it aloud without drowning in it. And through it all, Ethan sat at the center, forcing the adults to see the damage their choices had carved into his life. His voice grew stronger, his presence bolder. Slowly, change came. Ethan's monthly weekends in Portland became sacred time, first supervised, later on his own. In Helen's quiet home, away from the tension of Seattle, he found space to breathe. They hiked, they cooked, they talked about science and history until the nights grew long. With every visit, Helen felt the wound of those 15 lost years close a little more. And David, though pride still warred within him, began to shift. One evening during therapy, his voice cracked as he finally admitted the truth. It was easier to tell people you were sick than to admit I cut you out because I was angry. Then the lie trapped me. I didn't know how to undo it. It was not absolution, but it was a beginning. Now, as Helen watched Ethan animatedly show David his latest science fair project on the patio, she felt a fragile peace she hadn't known in decades. Laura approached with 2 glasses of lemonade, her tone softer than it had once been. "He still struggles to say it," she murmured, glancing at her husband. "But he's changing. Yesterday he told Ethan a story about you, about how you used to pack surprise lunches when he was little. Good memories. He had forgotten them." Helen accepted the glass, her smile tinged with wistfulness. Families are complicated. None of us gets it right all the time. Later, when the guests drifted away and the house grew quiet, Ethan handed her a wrapped gift. Inside was a photo album he had assembled, filled with pictures, old and new. Helen with David as a boy, Ethan's own milestones, and snapshots of their rediscovered time together. On the last page was a recent photograph of the 4 of them. Helen, David, Laura, and Ethan, standing together, imperfect but whole. Beneath it, Ethan had written in careful letters, "Family, imperfect, but ours." Tears blurred Helen's vision as she closed the album. She realized in that quiet moment that the lottery had never been her true fortune. The money remained hidden, speculated about but never confirmed. Her victory was something else entirely. It was this: the courage to face the ugliness of the past, the persistence to demand better, the willingness to begin again. That night, back in her hotel room, Helen opened the old storage box she had once filled with unsent gifts and torn letters. She touched the faded wrapping paper, the cards written in a younger hand, and for the first time, she felt no bitterness. She chose a few small items to keep, not as tokens of grief, but as markers of the road she had walked. Painful, yes, but leading her here. The past could never be erased, but the future stretched before her, unwritten, waiting to be lived one day at a time. And for the first time in decades, Helen Carter felt ready. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, share this story, and let your voice be heard in the comments. Your stories matter too.